Kia ora koutou. My name is Edward Miller. I'm the spokesperson for It's Our Future. It's Our Future is a citizens organisation focused on dangerous free trade and investment agreements, and we've been particularly active in the last 12 months or so around the TRIPS waiver, pushing New Zealand to go from, I guess, what we saw as being part of the problem to being a neutral part of the solution, and now trying to push New Zealand to become a more active part of the solution to break the current impasse at the WTO. There's a sort of inherent tension, I think, between the way the New Zealand government behaves on the international stage in terms of international diplomacy and how we behave on issues of international trade and commerce. We always like to think of ourselves as a good international citizen. That means that whenever there's a new human rights instrument that's being negotiated, New Zealand is there. We like to make sure that we're amongst the first signatories. We're very proud of the fact that we have an apparently independent foreign policy that really formed through the anti-nuclear movement in the 1980s. But also there's a bit of a couple of other sort of high points of that: active role in the anti-apartheid struggle, as well as, of course, giving women the vote first, and being maybe a bit more reluctant than some other nations to support US or NATO operations in various parts of the world. At the same time, however, New Zealand has been avowedly pro-free trade. We were a foundational membership of a member of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. We're part of the Cairns Group, the group of agricultural exporters that are very pro-agricultural trade liberalisation, regardless of the costs for countries in the global south. We're very proud of the fact that we were, in 2008, the first Western country to secure a fair trade agreement with China, a comprehensive fair trade agreement as well, and it's been a huge part of our economic success, or our largest trading partner since. We were also a founding member of what's called the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. That was the sort of Phoenix Agreement that came out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which collapsed after Donald Trump pulled the US out, but we were also part of the agreements that led up to the TPP, the P4, which was a club of neoliberal nations trying to trap US capital into a free trade agreement. So very much committed to the deep liberalisation because we were an agricultural exporting economy primarily. The New Zealand government, I guess, has been praised internationally for its COVID response, and part of this comes down to the star power, I guess, of Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. In July 2020, she co-authored a piece in the Washington Post with South African Prime Minister Cyril Ramaphosa, and I'll just read to you what I think is the important part. She said, "Whether you live should not determine whether you live, and global solidarity is central to saving lives and protecting the economy. A managed flow of the vaccine, including for humanitarian settings and other vulnerable countries, such as least developed countries and small island states, is the wise and strategic course of action and will benefit countries across the world." Which really sounds like she would be putting, or like the New Zealand government would put, public health ahead of profit, and supporting, for example, a TRIPS waiver when it came to light. But that was not the position of the New Zealand government, and was not the position of the New Zealand government in October 2020 when South Africa and India proposed the TRIPS waiver, probably a concern to the co-author of this article, as I said, Cyril Ramaphosa. In January of 2021, we worked with a whole series of organisations to get sign-on to a letter calling on the New Zealand government to support the TRIPS waiver, and it was signed by 42 organisations and experts, including the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions and many other unions, Amnesty NZ, Oxfam, Child Fund, Greenpeace, MSF, World Vision, etc. It had very broad support, and called on, in fact, Prime Minister Ardern to live up to the rhetoric that had been in that Washington Post article and to support a TRIPS waiver in line with the original demands of the TRIPS waiver, which, as we know, covered not just vaccines, but also other treatments and technologies. In March, we received a response to that letter, and I don't expect you to be able to read this text because it's very, very small, but I think I just pulled out some of the key parts of it. The government said it was open to consider all options with regards to a TRIPS waiver, but it tempered that by saying that it's important that the WTO look closely at if and how intellectual property rules impact the use of voluntary licensing, compulsory licensing, technology transfer, and other tools relevant to global capacity for vaccine manufacture and distribution. So effectively, here they're saying we should be looking at all the other options, not just a TRIPS waiver. A TRIPS waiver could be a potential issue. And crucially, also said that discussion also needs to recognize the role intellectual property plays in incentivizing investment in the development, manufacture, and distribution of new technologies. So falling back on that argument that intellectual property protection, strong intellectual property protection, is the catalyst for new investment and for new innovations taking place in this space, which we know in terms of COVID vaccines is not necessarily true. There's been a huge amount of public funding that's gone into those investments, and it wouldn't have been possible without public funding from the US and German governments, for example, to get the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, the one that we here in New Zealand exclusively rely on. And we also know that that's not really how pharmaceutical companies make money from innovation. They make money from buying their shares back and from the other more sort of nefarious financialized forms of investment. After we received the response, it became clear that there was a sort of third option developing, which was being spearheaded by the new WTO Director-General Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. Here's a quote from her talking about it, where she refers to a third way to broaden access through facilitating technology transfer within the framework of multilateral rules, so as to encourage research and innovation while at the same time allowing licensing agreements that help scale up manufacturing of medical products. Now, critics of the third way looked at it and said, well, we're struggling to actually find what's different between the third way and the first way. It basically just seems like you're asking big pharmaceutical giants really nicely to get into more relationships with other suppliers. But that was essentially what the third way was. And supporting countries, of course, were, don't know if you can see them all, but Australia, Canada, Chile, New Zealand, of course, Norway, and Turkey. That was kind of the third way bloc. There was a reasonably strong response to the third way. In April, a group of 200 plus signatories wrote to Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala condemning this approach. And we, It's Our Future, put out a media statement directed to the New Zealand government saying that it's time for New Zealand to end this charade and support the demands made by a majority of WTO members for a rules-based waiver to the intellectual property rules that have constrained vaccine manufacturing capacity. The third way didn't last very long, and the reason it didn't last very long is basically because of the massive spike that we saw in India of cases as a result of the Delta, the emergence of the Delta and various other mutations that were taking place, and particularly affecting India as a largely unvaccinated population, but one that had led the way in terms of the demands for a TRIPS waiver back in October 2020. There was a lot of discussion in the New Zealand media at the time. What's the best way that New Zealand can help India? Obviously, we have a large Indian population and good diplomatic relations with India. There were all these discussions on the newspaper, in the radio and so forth, saying, should we send assistance? Can we send other plant or material to assist? I, on the 5th of May, wrote this article saying that the best way New Zealand can help is to listen to what India's been saying for the past then 7 months. They were asking for a people's vaccine, and New Zealand should support that. It was somewhat fortuitous timing to be publishing this on the 5th of May, which incidentally is my birthday, and because also on the 5th of May, but in the United States, so kind of on the 6th of May for us, the US government came out declaring support for a patent waiver on COVID vaccines. So effectively a TRIPS waiver, but only covering the vaccines part of that. This came out at around about, at our time, 7:30 in the morning, and pretty soon after that, 8:31 in the morning, New Zealand policy had effectively changed by way of tweet. The Trade Minister Damien O'Connor warmly welcomed, and New Zealand policy did change in line with the US demand for a COVID vaccine waiver. So the question is, why the delay? Why did it take New Zealand 7 months to support a waiver which should have really been right within New Zealand's purview as a country that pursues diplomatic relations with India, the global south, and wants good human rights standards to be popularized around the world, right? And the popular opinion that New Zealand media or critics of New Zealand policy put forward was to say that New Zealand is very much in the thrall of US policy, that we need an indication from the US that something's okay before we can follow a course of action. So we're the little cat and they're the big cat, and we need to listen to what the big cat says before we can catch a mouse, something to that effect. However, colleagues of mine from another organisation called the New Zealand Alternative did some official information requests and found that actually there's more going on here. There was, for example, a request from the senior trade advisor to the Minister of Trade in December 2020, so after the waiver had come out, saying, what's our position on the TRIPS waiver? And the senior MFAT official replies the next day, we don't support the waiver. A couple of months later, there was an MFAT briefing to a range of ministers. Sorry, maybe the picture of me is obstructing what's written there. But there was a briefing to a range of ministers, including the Prime Minister, underscoring that, quote, New Zealand has economic interest in protecting the property rights and investments of innovative New Zealand health sector companies such as Fisher & Paykel Healthcare. And if you know much about the New Zealand economy, we hollowed out our manufacturing industries in the 1980s and 90s, and pretty much all that was left was Fisher & Paykel. It's been split into two parts, the appliances, which has all been offshored, and is now Chinese owned, but Fisher & Paykel Healthcare, which manufactures a whole range of health technologies and machinery plant, is still considered a proud New Zealand company that has really benefited from the COVID-19 pandemic. You can see here, this is a 5-year view of the Fisher & Paykel stock price, and you can see it rose from being around the $10, $15 mark up until 2020, and now is in the $30 to $40 mark over that last period. 2020, net profit, a huge record profit for Fisher & Paykel. Again, 2021, record profit for Fisher & Paykel. So it's very convenient that critics were saying that the New Zealand government is just hiding behind the demands of the US because we're afraid of what Joe Biden might do to us. Very convenient for companies like Fisher & Paykel, who've been able to ride that extremely profitable wave. But also the narrowing, I guess, of the Biden approach to a vaccine-only TRIPS waiver meant that the New Zealand government could shift its policy, despite the fact that the demand from TRIPS from India and South Africa and the vast majority of supporting countries is for a broad waiver. Our demands now, as it's our future and organisations that pushed for the waiver, is that New Zealand needs to leverage its bilateral trade negotiations to make sure that the remaining holdouts at the WTO can join the party. Effectively, now it's UK, EU, and Switzerland that are the major countries blocking the TRIPS waiver from coming into becoming a reality. New Zealand's currently negotiating free trade agreements with both the UK and with the EU, so we're demanding that the New Zealand government makes support for TRIPS waiver a prerequisite of concluding those bilateral negotiations. Now, normally this would be a pretty meaningless kind of demand. New Zealand is like an absolute price taker in most markets in which it engages in, and it's a small island nation, so we got rid of most of our barriers, our subsidies and all those kinds of supports, market supports. In the 1980s, New Zealand is always referred to as turning up to a game of strip poker naked. But in this case, we actually do have a little bit of countervailing power. The UK requires New Zealand's support for it to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. It can't get in there without us. So we could require it to support a TRIPS waiver so that we can conclude the current negotiation and it can join the CPTPP, which is the real aim of its bilateral negotiation for a free trade agreement with New Zealand, along with supporting the Commonwealth, etc. And I think this would put the EU in somewhat an embarrassing position. The EU has worked very hard to get a lot of social and environmental obligations into its negotiating mandate within the past couple of years and would not really want to appear less progressive than post-Brexit UK, which was a decision that was apparently motivated on largely kind of regressive, nationalist, populist bases. So those are our current negotiations, current positions in terms of the TRIPS waiver. Basically, we've gone from the position of New Zealand being a part of the problem to New Zealand being a player within the solution. We're pitching that New Zealand should play a much more active role and become push towards breaking the impasse, really becoming an active part of the solution to this current impasse so that we can drag the UK and possibly the EU over the line in terms of getting support for that TRIPS waiver. I'm sorry I can't join you today. I maybe should have mentioned this earlier, but more than happy to take any questions by email. I'm happy for Matthew to circulate my email in that respect. And thank you all very much for listening. Good luck with the rest of the symposium. Thanks very much.